Thanks for everyone who's still with us, and thanks for everybody that tuned in. Thanks for all the folks that showed up live. As Ed has said, we've got some number under 10. I don't think that we would have gotten more than 10 had there not been coronavirus going on, given the subject matter.
No.
But nonetheless, I'm really excited to be here and to be involved in something like this. Just to add a little bit to what Ed was saying, when we talk about why do we want to look at this stuff? And for me, about 10 years ago, somebody gave me the book How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, and that's a pretty popular book. A lot of us have read it. And one thing that really struck me in that book that stays with me is that the author said that I can't try to derive a meaning from the Bible that was not the original intention of the meaning of the author to the original audience. Amen. So I can't go perusing through the Bible and saying, oh well, this fits my purposes to mean this today. So that I have to, if I really want to be a reader of the Bible, I need to try to the best of my ability to understand what was the original audience thinking when they read this. What did this mean to them? What did this say to them? So in that spirit, I'll never forget, I was reading an Old Testament book, and we'll get into it in a different session later, but I read references to Old Testament characters in this New Testament book, and they were references that you could not find in the Old Testament itself, kind of what Ed was talking about. And I dug into it a little bit, and I'm like, and I realized, oh well, the New Testament author is actually referring to a non-biblical text that would have been popular to him at that time, and it just consumed me. And I just thought, wait a second. There's something else out there. There's something that and the way the authors and the way, and Ed mentioned it, the way that Jesus spoke to his audiences and the way these authors wrote to their audiences, they write as if you know this already, right? Because their audiences did know it already. So again, I want to echo what Ed said. We're not trying to make a case. We're not trying to change the world and make a case that these books need to be canonical. We're not going to petition Zondervan to change the way they publish their Bibles. It's really just simply we want to help you understand what we have found in these passages and how they've been helpful to us. So my lesson is called Explanatory Value. My subtitle is Why Bother? Right? Why bother? Why bother with this stuff, right? And what I'm going to do is go through some concepts that were very, very influential to the Second Temple Jewish period, that really shaped their thinking. It shaped the way they thought of the world. In addition to that, we're going to kind of ping off of that and actually take out some very specific New Testament passages, and I will do my best to link them back to Second Temple literature to kind of demonstrate how the authors were pinging off this. And these are passages that I'm willing to bet you have either glossed over in your reading because they didn't immediately make sense to you, so you just moved on, or maybe they were even offensive to you because you didn't understand the context, so you just moved on or tried to explain it away. But with the knowledge of the way people were thinking during the Second Jewish Temple period, we can be illuminated by that. So I'm going to start with something very easy, just a real easy little exercise, so to speak, and I'll use the folks here to kind of do some interaction. But in Acts chapter 7, we see the story of Stephen, or as Ed refers to him, even Stephen. And he is going at it with the Sanhedrin, and he's preaching to them, and it's starting to get heated. And in verse 72 of chapter 7, he says, "Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one." So there's this reference of prophets being killed, okay? And we see that in Acts chapter 7. Jesus references it several times. in Mark chapter 12. In the first few verses, he tells the parable of the tenants. And we all know this parable. A man plants a vineyard. He gives it over. He rents it out or whatever to some people that are supposed to watch it. Then he sends his servant to go check on it. And the servant gets beaten. He sends another servant. He gets beaten. He sends a third servant. This one gets killed. The parable goes on to say that he sends more. Some of them get beaten. Some of them get killed. And then ultimately he sends his son and he gets killed. And of course we all understand that the son is Jesus in the parable. And I think we all get that the servants, some who were beaten, some who were killed, is referencing prophets. It's the prophets that came prior to Jesus to look for fruit among the people of Israel, right, that they did not find. And Jesus tells this parable, and you don't see the people stand up and say, what are you talking about? Prophets being killed, right? In Luke 11, in Matthew 23, as he's pronouncing his woes to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, he says, he says to them, you build monuments to the prophets that your fathers killed. Right? So there's a running theme in the New Testament that the prophets were killed. But if you look in your Old Testament to try to find an account of a prophet being killed,
good point.
You can only find one.
Right.
Right? And it's in 2 Chronicles 24. You see the account of Zechariah the prophet being killed. But you don't see the account of any other prophets being killed. And in fact, you don't really learn the fate of too many other prophets at all by reading the Old Testament alone. However, there is a second temple Jewish text called The Lives of the Prophets. And I've got it up here on the screen behind me. Awesome. I don't know how helpful it is. I'm looking at it backwards in a mirror image, so it's useless to me. But hopefully you can read it. This is a first century writing. Is when we have been able to find the earliest sort of manuscript of it. But there's little doubt that this was an oral tradition that would have been passed down and maybe formalized in the Second Temple period. But just kind of look at some of the things that's being said here. I'm just going to read it. It says, Isaiah from Jerusalem died under Manasseh by being sawed in two.
Wow.
Right? And speaking of the Hall of Faith, Ed talked about that in chapter 11 of Hebrews, verse 37. It specifically mentions someone being sawed in two. The audience of that original letter knew they were talking about Isaiah.
Yeah.
We maybe don't, but we do now, right?
Wow.
Jeremiah was from Anathoth, and he died in Taphni of Egypt, having been stoned by his people. We know from the book of Jeremiah that he ended up in Egypt against his better judgment after the destruction of Jerusalem, but we don't know how he ended. But according to this writing, this Second Temple writing, he was stoned by his own people. And you're going to see this thread. He's in a foreign country, but it's not the foreigners that kill him. It's his own people that kill him. Ezekiel died in the land of the Chaldeans, or Babylon. We know from the book of Ezekiel opens with him in captivity. But again, it says the ruler of the people Israel killed him as he was being reproved by him concerning the worship of idols. It would seem from this text that even under captivity in Babylon, they had some sort of a provincial type government system where the people could rule themselves and deal with certain things, because it was an Israelite leader, according to this text, that killed Ezekiel, not a Babylonian.
Wow.
And it's interesting to me, and just if you like, here's just a bonus. You know, I think about Daniel, the book of Daniel in Babylon, and I think about. It says here in this passage that Ezekiel was reproving the leader of Israel concerning the worship of idols. Essentially, he was kind of letting him have it for worshiping idols. You think, what? An Israelite in Babylon was worshiping an idol? And then it makes me ping back to Daniel when Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are told they need to bow down and worship an idol. They don't, but what about all the other Jews that were there?
Yeah.
You know, we don't think about that,
Right.
but when we see texts like this, it's like, well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not the only ones in Babylon.
Yeah.
While they stood strong and got thrown in the furnace, was everybody else bowing? You know, we don't get that, but we're illuminated by availing ourselves of these other texts. Having done many things to Ahab, Micaiah the Morathite was killed by Joram his son at a cliff because he rebuked him for the impieties of his fathers. This is likely the Micaiah that we find in 1 Kings 22, not Micah that we have a book from, because he was not a contemporary of Ahab. Amos was from Tekoa, and when Amaziah had tortured him sorely, at last his son also killed him with a club by striking him on the temple. So here's a prophet being tortured by his own people. Then Joash, king of Judah, and this is the one that is in the Bible, the killing of Zechariah that Jesus references in Matthew 23. So when Stephen is standing there talking to the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 7, and he's saying to them, you killed the prophets, these stories would have been resonating in the mind. And that, by the way, is when the Sanhedrin turned on him. That's when it went from a tense conversation to a hostile conversation, right? But that's just kind of a warm-up. I want to go and get a little deep now into, Ed mentioned the book of Enoch. In the book of Enoch, we tend to see it collected as what's called First Enoch. It's a very large volume of works, and it's largely believed to have been written 200, 300 BC, primarily, although there are some texts that I'm not going to be referencing that are of a questionable date, that they think maybe were written in a post-Christian era. But the stuff that I'm going to be referencing in this particular lesson are from what's called the Book of the Watchers. And that is practically undisputable that it was written, 1st, 2nd century, 3rd century, maybe even BC. And so here's the deal. First Enoch, and I can't stress this enough, it profoundly shaped the way Hellenistic Jews of the Second Temple period, saw the world. It's how they understood good and evil. It's how they understood the purposes of God and the purposes of evil. And a large part of the early part of the book is expanding upon Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. You can flip there and read it really quickly if you want, but Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is this mysterious passage that you never want to talk to your children about, where the sons of God see that the daughters of man are beautiful, and they go and they take wives from among them. And then it goes on to indicate that children are born of this union, and they're giants. They're Nephilim. They're giants. And interestingly, if you follow that out in chapter 6, it's right after that God decides that he's had it with mankind and has to bring on the flood. But we read past that passage, and we don't know what to do with it.
That's true.
And we don't want to talk about it. And it goes all the way back to the early church, not wanting to talk about it. Around the 3rd, 4th, 5th century A.D., there came about this development of what they call the Sethite theory. And Augustine, by the way, who went on to become a very influential theologian in what we know of as Western Christianity, he was a proponent of the Sethite theory. And what the Sethite theory said was Adam and Eve had 3 sons, Cain, Abel, Seth. Abel, of course, was killed. Cain was banished. Seth remained pure, and he remained good. And his descendants, in their purity, would not take wives from the descendants of Cain. Okay, that's the theory. That's not in the Bible. That's not in any Second Temple literature, but that's the theory.
Okay.
And what they will say, the Sethite theory, is that chapter 6 of Genesis, the sons of man and the daughters or the sons of God and the daughters of man, is simply the sons of Seth taking wives from the daughters of Cain. And that was the awful thing that happened. Nothing supernatural, no angels, no giants. And it was really just a means of sterilizing your Bible. It was a means of taming the story of God, right?
Wow.
To make it more palatable, to make it more, dare I say, politically correct in their own sort of parlance of the time. This was around the time that Rome and the Christian church was starting to get in bed together, church and state. You got to make everything look right. You don't want anything that doesn't make sense or that can't be easily explained and reasoned out. But if you look at the original language, it says the sons of God. It's Lahoyim. It's a variation off the word Elohim, and they gave birth to giants. This is a big deal, right? This is a big deal, and we need to kind of understand this, right, to the best that we can. But unfortunately, our Bible does not give us a whole lot of context, right? So be it. But lest you want to just ignore it, if you just want to flip the page and go to Genesis chapter 7 and move on, if you're paying attention as you read your Bible, you can't get away from it. Yeah. There are giants all throughout the early part of the Old Testament. In Numbers 13, when they go in and spy out the Promised Land, they come back and they say, hey, the Nephilim are there. There's that word again. You can't get rid of it. There were giants in the Promised Land that scared the spies. Right. In Deuteronomy, Moses is talking about giants. In chapter 2, and in particular in chapter 3, verse 11, he recounts how they defeated Og of Bashan. He was a king. But he points out that Og was from the Rephaim. Yeah. The Rephaim is a word for giant. Right. He says that Og was the only remnant of the Rephaim. We're going to get back to that later. So remember Og. I got something funny later. All right. Comical. But and in Deuteronomy 3:11, Moses even goes to the point of telling you how big his bed was. That's right. I'll leave you to go back and read that. Deuteronomy 3:11. It's like a 13-foot bed. Yeah. Yeah. And he goes and he says it's still there. You can go see it if you want. I mean, Moses is saying, hey, he was a giant. We have evidence that he's a giant. I'm not playing. He was a giant. You can go check it out yourself. He was a giant. Wow. When Joshua goes into the Promised Land, he goes about killing giants. Yep. All right. In chapter 11, it talks about cutting off the Anakim from the hill country. In Joshua 14, Caleb, one of the original spies from Numbers 13, he says, "Give me the hill country of Judah, and I will drive the Anakim out of it." Those are giants that he's talking about. And it says in chapter 15 that indeed he did do that. In 2 Samuel, we're told about, chapter 21, we're told about a man with 6 hands, or 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes, and he was a descendant of the giants. Right? And of course, the one story that we do pay attention to is, of course, David and Goliath from 1 Samuel 17. Amen. But even that we turn into a fairy tale. Right. And we turned it into a metaphor for facing the giants in your own life. I'm sorry, that's not why that was written. It was not written so that you could get a good grade on the SAT or whatever it is that you're freaked out about in your life. That's not what this is about. Goliath was a 9-foot tall descendant of the giants. And he was and he was not just the champion of the Philistines, he was a champion of the dark forces of evil that transgressed and rebelled openly against God in Genesis chapter 6. And that story in 1 Samuel is about the forces of evil battling against the upside kingdom of God. Amen. And this little preteen shepherd boy smelling like a sheep going up against this giant. It's clearly a messianic pointer, quite frankly. I mean, David is a he's this humble person that you would not give regard to otherwise, but there he is, right? Yep. So, giants, right? So with that in mind, I just want to read through some of this Enochian, some of this stuff from the book of First Enoch. So First Enoch 6. I'm just going to read through it briefly. I won't read through the first couple of verses here that you can see behind me because they're just sort of recounting Genesis chapter 6. But it introduces in verse 3, it says, and Simjaza, Simjaza, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Oh, did I forget to? Sorry. Amen. There we go. Okay. It says here that Simjaza, I'm down in verse 3, and Simjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, let us all swear on oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan. So these angels came up with this plan. We're going to go down to earth and we're going to take wives from among men. But their leader said, hey, I have a feeling you guys are going to do that fake out on me, and I'm going to get left holding the bag. So they all go ahead and they swear this oath. And then it goes on. And they go down to Mount Hermon. You can see that in verse 6. And it says that the names of their leaders, they personalize it, right? There's these names of the leaders of these. It was 200 angels that did this transgression,
wow.
according to the book of Enoch, as it explains Genesis chapter 6. Moving on to 1 Enoch chapter 7, it says that they start doing some pretty evil stuff, right?
Yeah.
They start teaching them how to use charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots. It's like necromancy type stuff,
wow.
right? Witchcraft type stuff. And they became pregnant. And this is from Genesis chapter 6. And they gave birth to giants, and these giants consumed the acquisitions of men. And when the men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against and devoured mankind. And
wow.
it goes on and on and on, right?
Wow.
And then when you get to Enoch chapter 8, it says, and this is important, it references Azazel. Azazel was one of the leaders of these fallen angels. We're going to come back to his name several times,
yep.
so stick with this. We will see him. I'm actually going to find his name in the Old Testament for you.
Wow.
But,
come on, bro.
It says that he taught them the use of swords, knives, and shields. Okay, warfare. He taught them how to make war. Right? It goes on to say, and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth, and the art of working with them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony. Antimony was maybe you guys know this, but it's like you make makeup out of it,
Ooh,
right?
okay.
It's a natural element that you make makeup out of. The beautifying of the eyelids. So lust. So we got warfare that was taught by these angels. Lust. Ed mentioned earlier that in some of the, and I'm just going to put that, we're going to look at some passages. Women don't get treated incredibly well in Second Temple literature. I'm just putting that out there. I'm not endorsing this stuff. I'm just saying it. But you will see throughout as we go through this that women adorning themselves is cast in a very bad light as being designed to incite lust.
Wow.
Just again, I don't care whether you wear makeup or what you do with your hair. I'm just telling you the context of what we're looking at here. But, so warfare and lust. And then all kinds of costly stones at the end of verse 1. So now we got greed, right? So what the author is trying to say is that not only did these angels come down and choose wives and have these giants that all this bad stuff happened as a result of, but they also taught them evil. They also taught them how to do evil. And it was the evil that would result in God deciding that he needed to destroy the earth in a flood.
Wow.
Again,
Yep.
now, I find this stuff fascinating. I'm not telling you that it's true or that you need to believe it's true. I am telling you that the Second Temple Jews, which would include the apostles and the people that they were writing to, they read this stuff.
That's right.
I won't try to comment on what they thought of it, but they were reading it. And I'll demonstrate that to you in a little bit. Let's move on. So this just goes, so in this passage, in Enoch 9, it says, and then Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. Now, a couple of those names you recognize from the New Testament, from the book of Daniel. These are the good angels. And they're basically going down, and they're seeing what happens, and they're outraged by it, and they go to God. You can read this. And they're basically saying, we've got to do something. Right? And in verse 6, I have it underlined down here. It says, thou seest what Azazel hath done, who hath taught all unrighteousness on earth, and revealed the eternal secrets which were preserved in heaven, which men were striving to learn. And I find this very interesting because in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve, they eat from the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
It would seem as if they were trying to learn something.
Yeah.
But we don't really see in Genesis 3 that they learned anything other than that they were naked and that they needed to hide from God. And what this passage here seems to insinuate is that even though there was this fall in Genesis chapter 3, God had held back the knowledge of evil. But these angels, when they transgressed, they shared this evil with the people, in terms of warfare, lust, and greed. And you see the earth get to a point that it is so evil that it needs to be destroyed by the flood. And that's what we see in... Got my slides all messed up here. But anyway, that's what we see in... whoa, look at all this. Okay, we're way off.
You just go backwards.
Am I going back?
No, so you can just scroll.
Okay.
There you go.
Right. Okay. But anyway, so let me get to 10. Yeah, so in 10 is where we actually see where God says, okay, fine, enough evidence, let's go do something about it. And he tells them to go have Noah hide himself, or otherwise build an ark. And that's where we have that, right? So I go through all of this just to simply say this absolutely informed the thinking of the Second Temple Jews. They saw this as this is the cause of evil in the world, and this is what needs to be remedied in the world. And I just want you to have sort of that as a foundation as we go through some of these other things that we're going to talk about later. There is one thing, though, that you should be tripped up about at this point. We started off talking about the fact that giants were born, according to Genesis 6. And I illustrated to you that we see we see giants in the book of Numbers, in the book of Deuteronomy, in the book of Joshua, 1st and 2nd Samuel. But these giants were born pre-flood.
Yep.
And then there's a flood.
Well,
And the Bible tells us that only Noah and his family were on the ark. So wouldn't it stand to reason that all of the giants would have been killed in the flood? Well, this is kind of funny, but there's this thing called the Jewish Midrash, and it's just a series of commentaries that Jewish rabbis and Jewish scholars and Jewish, priestly characters would write on the Old Testament, and it was designed to give explanatory value, right? Similar to what we're trying to do here. And there was one particular midrash that explained this, and I'll show it to you now. And it says, and again, this is a Jewish midrash. It says, as the floodwaters swelled, Og, remember Og was the one that Moses killed, had the 13-foot bed. Moses said that he was the only remnant of the Rephaim. It says that Og, king of Bashan, sat himself on one of the rungs of the ark's ladders and swore to Noah and to his sons that he would be their slave forever. And what did Noah do? He punched a hole in the ark, and through it, he handed out food to Og every day. So this is how the Jews sort of dealt with the mystery of how the giants would have survived into the post-flood era. The idea being that Og, being the only survivor of the flood amongst the Rephaim, would have proliferated offspring of his own after the flood, and that's who we see in these various instances in the Old Testament where we see these guys. Okay, so now explanatory value, right? All this is supposed to help us understand something, right? So if you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and I kind of imagine this being a little bit more interactive, but all of these cameras and lights are rather distracting. So
come on, Tim.
I'm just
We're
going to
with
go.
you, brother.
So if you look at 1 Corinthians 11, you're going to find one of these sections of the Bible that nobody wants to talk about. All right, and it's all about head coverings.
Yep.
Right? So
What?
I'm just going to pick up in chapter 11. Let's see. How about verse 5? It says, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off, or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from a woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. And then in verse 10 it says, it is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. So when we get to these strange sort of sections in Paul's writings, we either don't talk about it or we try to quickly, urgently, frantically explain it away.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Say, oh, no, he was just talking about some social context that applied only to the Corinthians, or it was only in that period of time that mattered. This was about modesty. I was researching this. Somebody had an article that said, oh, no, in Corinth at that time, women would cover their head when they were out of the house in formal settings, but in informal settings at home, they would uncover their head. And since the churches were all happening inside people's homes, the women were having their heads uncovered because they were in their homes. They thought, and Paul said, no, this is a form. It was ridiculous. It was a ridiculous article to try to explain why Paul says women need to have their head covered, when he tells us exactly why they need to have their head covered, because of the angels.
Yep.
Very specific. Well, where does that leave us? Right? Because of the angels. Well, we just spent a half hour that was probably very, very boring for you going through this Enochian literature about these angels being lured to earth because of lust for human women.
Yeah.
So could it be that Paul was thinking about that when he said, because of the angels, women should have their heads covered? Maybe, based on that alone. If I were you, I'd be saying, it's a little bit of a stretch.
Well,
Can you make a better connection? Yes.
amen. Come on, Tim.
There is a text out there called the Testaments of the Patriarchs.
Yep.
Again, Second Temple literature. And the idea being that each of the patriarchs, 12 patriarchs, sons of Jacob, so Levi, Reuben, Judah, those guys, each of them has a testament, a writing that's attributed to them. To Ed's point earlier, it's surely pseudepigraphal. It's not as if they wrote it themselves. Some might argue that they passed it down verbally, and then it finally got written down. But it would have been available. This would have been available probably in the first century. It probably would have been available to Paul. And one of these 12 testaments is the Testament of Reuben. So I'll ask the group, in birth order, which son was Reuben? First. That's exactly right. Now, in ancient Near Eastern culture, is being the firstborn son a big deal?
Yes. Yeah.
It's a very big deal. You would expect that Reuben, being the firstborn, that all throughout the history of Israel, you would hear about him and his tribe. But we don't. We don't hear about Reuben much at all outside of the book of Genesis.
That's right.
We don't hear about his tribe. We don't hear about his descendants. Why is that? Oh, we got the smartest persons in the back of the class. That's not a good idea. We need to move up to the front. The answer was he slept with his father's concubine wife. He slept with Bilhah in the book of Genesis. So Reuben himself this is quite complicated. This is better than any soap opera. He was the son of Leah, and Bilhah was the servant of Rachel. It's quite a triangle, right? But anyway, he sleeps with Bilhah. He sleeps with his father's wife. And it is a great and grievous sin, and it costs him his birthright. In Genesis 49, Jacob, as he's about to die, gives a blessing to each of his sons. And to Reuben, he says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. Right? He sounds like he had a lot going for him, right? But then he goes on to say, turbulent as the waters, you will excel no more, for you went up into your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it. So if Reuben were to write a testament to his offspring, and that's what a lot of these patriarchal testaments are. It's like letters to your sons, advice to your sons.
Yeah.
What do you think Reuben's advice to his sons would be? What would be the theme of his testament?
Guard your eyes.
Yeah, exactly. He would be telling them, hey, watch out for lust.
Yeah.
watch out for fornication, watch out for adultery, and indeed it was. It's, if you can look it up on the internet, it's a couple pages long. It's a great read, as they all are. But I'm going to share with you just a piece of it. And I'll just read it to you if you're not able to see it. It says, and this is the testament of Reuben to his sons, "Flee, therefore, fornication, my children, and command your wives and your daughters that they adorn not their heads and faces to deceive the mind. Because every woman who useth these wiles hath been reserved for eternal punishment." Now here's the kicker. "For thus they allured the watchers who were before the flood.
Oh, yeah.
For as these continually beheld them, they lusted after them, and they conceived the act in their mind," so on and so forth, right? And so the idea, he's linking the adornment of the head, the adornment of the hair, the whatever it is, as being somehow, and again, I'm not saying you need to believe this. I'm just saying it's here.
Right.
And there's no doubt in my mind, Paul knew about it.
Amen.
And and Paul's telling, and maybe he's just using it as a euphemism, but there's no doubt in my mind when he tells Corinthian women, hey, you need to cover your head because of the angels. There's no doubt in my mind he's thinking along these lines. Now, I don't know that Paul was really afraid that angels were going to come and redo that deed, but nonetheless, you're going to have a hard time convincing me that this is not what he was referring to in 1 Corinthians, the passage that you've probably read 100 times and just said, I'm not going to bother. Because my wife doesn't wear head coverings. I don't want her to wear head. Yeah, look, this is fun, right? So, next difficult passage, judging the angels. Judging the angels. So in 1 Corinthians 6, there's this passage where Paul is laying into the Corinthian church, and he's reproving them for a lot of things. But one of the things that he reproves them for is that they're taking each other to court. He says, you guys are suing each other. This isn't right for God's people. And at one point he says, don't you know that you will judge angels? I don't know about you, but that seems a little odd to me.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about heaven and yeah, it's going to be great, and we're going to reign with Christ, and but like, what am I going to judge angels for? Like, the angels can't get along. They sue one another. They spill hot coffee on each other. I don't know what it is. That's a passage that should tweak you a little bit,
Amen.
right?
Yep.
But again, you can get some help in your Second Temple literature.
Amen.
In the
Come
4th
on.
chapter of 1st Enoch, it talks about Enoch, and I should back up just a little bit. Part of the whole premise of the book of Enoch is that we see in Genesis chapter 5 that he's taken, right? He doesn't die. He walks with the Lord and is taken and was no more. Part of the premise of all the writings is that these things were revealed to him as he was taken, right?
Ooh,
He was taken and things were revealed to him. Later Enochian writings, they actually refer to him as the Son of Man. But those are, I think, questionable in terms of the dating of those things.
Right.
So those could be post-Christian. But this is definitely not post-Christian. But it says here, I'll just pick up in the second sentence. I saw in my sleep, this is Enoch talking, what I will now say with a tongue of flesh and with the breath of my mouth, which the great, this is very poetic. They took a long time to get to the point. Which the Great One has given to men to converse therewith and understand with the heart, as he has created and given, skipping the parenthesis, me the power of reprimanding the watchers, the children of heaven. So this idea, so these watchers, again, all back to the story, Genesis 6, these watchers, these angels, these fallen angels, these sons of God, they've done this deed, they've proliferated all this evil. Enoch has been taken away, and somehow he's been put in the judgment seat on behalf of God. And which angels is he going to need to be judged? Well, obviously the fallen angels, these Nephilim angels. And so leaping into 1 Corinthians, the Second Temple Jews were writing stuff like this in a messianic, apocalyptic sort of fervor, right? They didn't know Jesus, so they were writing about Enoch, right?
Wow.
Enoch was kind of their apocalyptic character, right?
I see.
But
Yeah.
we know Jesus,
Amen.
right? And Paul
Amen.
knew Jesus, right?
Wow.
So Paul says in Ephesians 2, verse 6, that we're seated with Christ in the heavenly realms. And if we're seated with Christ, we must be on his throne. And if he is the realized Enochian character, then he will be judging the angels, not some character like Enoch.
Yeah.
And indeed, Jesus says that all judgment is given to him, John 5:22. And if we're seated with Jesus, and Jesus is going to take on this mantle of Enoch and judge the angels, then we will too judge the angels, because we're going to be sitting on the judgment seat with him. Again, if you're still paying
there.
attention,
We are, brother. This is
you might
great.
find that
It's so
interesting.
much
This
fun.
stuff blows my mind. I love it.
Come on, Tim.
So now we're going to go to probably the hardest book in the Bible, right? Revelation. Everybody wants to know about Revelation. We're just going to touch on a little bit. And I just ask a question. Throw this question out.
All right.
Ben can't answer it because we were talking about it earlier. But if I talk to you about the mark in the book of Revelation, the mark, what mark am I talking about?
For the beast.
The mark of the beast, right?
666.
666. 666. The mark of the beast. It's this mark that people take on in Revelation chapter 13, verses 16 through 18, so that they can conduct commerce. Later in the Bible, in chapters 19 and I think in 20, things don't go well for those folks that have this mark. But interestingly, and not a lot of folks know this, but there's two marks in the book of Revelation. In Revelation 7, it says, starting in verse 1, "After this I saw four angels standing at the four corners of the earth, holding back the four winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or on any tree. Then I saw another angel coming from the east, having the seal of the living God. He called out in a loud voice to the four angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of God." And it goes on to talk about these 144,000, these remnants that are somehow going to be, they're going to be protected from the coming destruction. And this idea of a mark was very important in the later Jewish period, leading into the second temple period and in the second temple period. So the Jews have always been marked by circumcision.
Ooh,
Right? Circumcision was the original mark. That was the mark of the covenant, the sign of the covenant. And it distinguished them as God's people. So if ever there was going to be a judgment upon the earth, and God was going to come in and destroy some and save others, well, the mark of circumcision would preserve the Jews.
Amen.
But in the second temple period, and Ed talked about this, the Maccabees, they came into power, and there was this period of independence, but they ended up, they were corrupt and they were compromised, and the temple system got messed up, and that's why the Essenes left and went out into the desert. And so what you find is a group of people longing for the day of the Lord, but they're in a period of time where being Jewish doesn't make you righteous in their mind, because our own priests are corrupt, our own kings are corrupt,
Right.
and they needed a new mark and I'm not saying they absolutely believe this literally, but metaphorically, it's like, what will the mark be? So we see these ideas of a mark of righteousness being put on. So in the Psalms of Solomon, and Ed mentioned that this is in the Septuagint. These are writings from probably the 1st or 2nd century BC, before Jesus, and you can read where the writer is talking about this time to come, and he says, "The one who does these things will never stagger from evil. The flame of fire and anger against the wrongdoers will not touch him when it goes out from the Lord's presence against the sinners to destroy every confidence of the sinners. For God's mark is on the righteous for salvation.
Wow.
Famine and sword and death will be far from the righteous, for they will flee from the saints like those pursued by war. But they will pursue sinners and overtake them, For those who act flawlessly will not escape the Lord's judgment. They will be overtaken as by experts in war, because the mark of destruction is on their heads.
Ooh.
And it goes on, and you'll notice
Good point.
if you look at this idea of salvation, I don't think salvation in the Old Testament is attached to the nation of Israel. Israel will
Yep.
see salvation.
Yeah.
But when we get to the time of Jesus, it's clearly different, right? There's a
Yeah.
different. It's kind of looked at individually, or it's looked at communally in the church, and you can see in the wisdom of Solomon, the people of Israel, they're struggling with this. They're struggling with this transition. It's not that the nation of Israel, by terms of heritage or by terms of geopolitical place in the world, are made righteous. It's rather something else, and it's a separation of the righteous and the sinful. And it talks of these marks that John, when he writes Revelation, goes to ping on. Right? He's pinging on this same type of literature. This isn't completely foreign to the New Testament. Lastly, we're going to close out. We're going to look at 1 Enoch 10.
You try to read off of there so they hear you.
Oh, okay.
You turn that way, they don't hear you.
Did you guys hear what Ed said? Okay. I apologize. Apparently, you guys aren't hearing me because I'm talking away from the microphone. Go figure. But anyway, I want to look at one more passage, and it's 1 Enoch 10. We've already looked at 1 Enoch 10 a little bit, but I want to compare it to Revelation 20. So Revelation 20 is a story of the judgment, right?
Okay.
It's the story of how evil will be dealt with, right?
Right.
In the book of Revelation. I'm just going to read a little bit of it, starting in verse 1. It says, "And I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss, and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time. I saw thrones on which were seated those who had been given authority to judge. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of the testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image. They had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years was ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Verse 7, when the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number, they are like the sand of the seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever.
Wow.
So that's our book of Revelation. But with that in mind, let's look at 1 Enoch 10.
Okay.
All right.
And I want to look specifically, and this is the recounting of God's dealing with these fallen angels for what they did in Genesis chapter 6. In verse 4, it says, "And again the Lord said to Raphael, bind Azazel hand and foot." Remember Azazel, we're not done with him yet. "Bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is Dudiel," which I think is a word for Sheol, the realm of the dead. "And cast him therein, and place upon him the rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face, that he may not see light. And on the day of the great judgment, he shall be cast into the fire, and heal the earth,
Wow.
which the angels have corrupted, and proclaim the healing of the earth, that they may heal the plague, and all that the children and that all the children of men may not perish through all the secret things that the watchers have disclosed and have taught their sons, and the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel." Then you drop down to verse 11, and you see how Simjaza gets dealt with. Verse 11 says, "And the Lord said to Michael, Go bind Simjaza and his associates who have united themselves with women so as to defile themselves with them in all their uncleanness. And when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. In those days they shall be led off to the abyss of fire,
Wow.
and torment in the prison in which they shall be confined forever. And whosoever shall be condemned and destroyed will from thenceforth be bound together with them to the end of all generations."
Wow.
But just to kind of maybe give you a little bit of a visual pointer, just kind of, you got these three columns on this slide right here. In Revelation 20, an angel is sent by Christ. In Enoch 10, 4 through 6, Raphael is authorized by God to go seal Azazel. He's told. Michael in verse 11 is told by God to go bind Simjaza. In Revelations, Satan, the dragon, he gets thrown into a pit and locked up. Enoch 10, verses 4 through 6, Raphael casts Azazel into the darkness and covers him.
Wow.
You know, this idea of binding him, right?
Yeah.
In Michael, likewise, to Simjaza, binds him in the valleys of the earth.
Wow.
In Revelations 20, while Satan is bound in the pit, he's not able to deceive anymore. There's this 1,000 years, apparently, of lack of his influence, right? Whereas in the Enochian passages, after Azazel is bound, it heals the earth that has been corrupted by the Watchers. And after Simjaza is bound, there's 70 generations of evil that are ended.
Good point.
And then in Revelation, at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is released, but he's ultimately thrown into the lake of fire for eternal torture. And likewise, Azazel is cast into a fire on the day of judgment, and Simjaza is led ultimately to an abyss of fire.
Wow.
Now, what's going on here? Look, it is not. It's not as if I'm not trying to go so far as to suggest for a second that John was like, plagiarizing or something like that.
Yeah.
But the Holy Spirit used John to write the book of Revelation, but John was a unique individual.
Yes.
And John was influenced by his world. Just if God was somehow going to take hold of you to have you do something, it would be you that did it, right? You would be inspired by the Holy Spirit, but he would be using you and all that has shaped you to accomplish his works. And when we look at the Bible, when we look at the New Testament, we're seeing human beings that have been inspired and used by God in their own way, right? In their own unique way. And there's little doubt in my mind when I read this stuff that John knew his first Enoch 10.
Amen.
There's no doubt in my mind.
Yeah. Great point.
I got one last thing, and this will be an easy one and a fun one.
All right. Come on.
I need you guys to participate. So
right.
somebody with an NIV, turn over to Leviticus 16.
All right. I'll do it.
And simultaneously, I'd like someone who has an ESV to turn over to Leviticus 16.
Okay, got it.
Let me get to Leviticus 16. Go ahead. The NIV person, read verses 8 through 10 in chapter 16. Nice and loud.
All right. He is to cast lots for the two goats, one for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for the sin offering. But the goat chosen by Lot as a scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord and used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Now, who's going to read the ESV version? Ed?
And Aaron shall cast lots over the two goats, one for the Lord and the other for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel.
Wow. I don't know if you guys were able to hear that clearly, but the NIV talks about a scapegoat, a goat being made into a scapegoat and sent out into the wilderness. But the ESV says that a goat is sent in the wilderness to Azazel. And I told you to remember the name Azazel, right? But the interesting thing here, so number one, if you look at the words, if you look at the Hebrew, it does say Azazel. And if you try to find a definition for Azazel, you'll find that we have retroactively defined that as a scapegoat. We've kind of circularly defined that word. But you'll also find that we really don't know what that word means. And that's like trying to define the word Paul. There's no definition for it because it's a name. Yeah. And you can't define Azazel because it's a name. It's the name for a fallen angel, right? And that's how the Bible was written. But because our translators have come across and said, gee, I don't understand that. That looks pretty tough. Why don't I just say scapegoat, right? But interesting to me is that if we go back to 1 Enoch 10, it talks about in verse 4, and some of this we're rereading, but it says, and again the Lord said to Raphael, bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness and make an opening in the desert.
Whoa.
Okay, so the Hebrew word for desert is the same word that's used for wilderness, right? Which is what's being used in Leviticus. They're sending the goat into the wilderness. Bind him in the desert, which is Dudael, and cast him therein. So there's this idea that Azazel is out there, right? Wow. In the desert, bound. And that's where they're sending. That's where they're sending the goat, right? And then down in verse 8 it says, and the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. You remember earlier I talked about war, lust, and greed. Yeah. But then what I have bolded here, it says, to him ascribe all sin.
Wow.
Is that not what we do with a scapegoat?
That's right.
Right? The scapegoat is what you blame everything on, right? And you got 1 Enoch 10 saying, blame it all on Azazel. And then we get to Leviticus and they're saying, send this goat that bears all the sin of the people out into the wilderness and let Azazel have him, because that's the business that he's in, right? And that's what that's about, right? And I can't explain that, but I don't want to miss it. I don't want to not read it. I don't want to not see it as it is, and I don't want to fail to understand what all of the original readers of the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Apocrypha, were thinking as they were reading this. So that brings me to the end of my thing. I appreciate those of you that haven't dropped off in the midst of it. I'm hoping that this sets us up well for what we're going to see tomorrow with Ben and Drew. Again, I just can't stress enough how important this literature has been to my own personal Bible study.
Amen.
And I hope that you guys are inspired to dig into it a little bit. I would ask one thing though, for those of you that are going to come back in tomorrow, I'm going to be doing another lesson on messianic pointers. And I would like it very much if you did a little homework.
All right.
And that would be read the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Then read Deuteronomy 32. I think it's
18.
verses 8 through 10.
Yeah,
I think it's 8 through 10. And Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 10. And then read Psalm 82.
All right.
Because they're going to play heavily into one of the Dead Sea Scroll documents that we're going to look at tomorrow when I come around again. But anyway, thanks for being safe. Thanks for tuning in, and prayerfully we'll see you on the other side tomorrow.